Stolen Brains by Captain S. P. Meek. Part 3 of 4. One of the men stepped forward and dexterously removed the doctor's automatic and frisked him expertly to ensure himself that he had no other weapon concealed.
"Bring him to the cave,"
directed Slavatsky, who, though obviously still shaken, had just as obviously recovered enough to be a very dangerous man. Two of the men grasped the doctor and led him along toward the entrance of the laboratory cave, which stood wide open in the gathering daylight. Frank paused long enough to shut the side of the hill and conceal the ship, and then followed the doctor. In the cave, the door was shut, and the doctor placed against the wall, under the window through which he had peered earlier in the night. Slavatsky took his seat at the table, his malignant black eyes boring into the doctor. Carson and Willis sat on the edge of the operating table, evidently still partially under the effects of the anesthetic that had been administered to them.
"How did you get back here?"
demanded Slavatsky. "Find out," snapped Dr. Bird. The dwarf rose threateningly.
"Speak respectfully to me. I am the master of the world,"
he roared in an angry voice.
"Answer my questions when I speak, or means will be found to make you answer. How did you get back here?"
Dr. Bird maintained a stubborn silence, his fierce eyes answering the dwarf's, look for look, and his prominent chin jutting out a little more squarely. Carson suddenly broke the silence.
"That's not the bird we had earlier,"
he cried as he staggered to his feet.
"What do you mean?"
demanded Slavatsky, whirling on him.
"Look at his hands,"
replied Carson, pointing. Slavatsky looked at Dr. Bird's long, mobile fingers, and an evil leer came over his countenance.
"So, Dr. Bird,"
he said slowly,
"you thought to match wits with Ivan Slavatsky, the greatest mind of all the ages. For a time you fooled me when your double was operated on here, but not for long. I presume you thought we had no way of detecting the substitution? You have discovered differently. Where is your friend, Mr. Carnes?"
"Didn't your men leave him in the cabin where you kidnapped me?" Slavatsky looked at Frank inquiringly. "He stayed in the cabin if he was in it when we got there," the leader of the kidnapping gang replied. "He got a full shot of lethane, and he's due to be asleep yet. I don't know how this man recovered. I left him there myself."
"Fool!"
shrieked Slavatsky.
"You brought me a double, a dummy, whom I wasted my time in operating on. Was the other a dummy too?"
"I didn't enter the cabin." Slavatsky shrugged his shoulders.
"If that is all the good the menthium I have injected has done you, I might as well have saved it. It doesn't matter, however. We have the one we wanted. Dr. Bird, it was very thoughtful of you to come here and offer your marvelous brain to strengthen mine. I have no doubt that you will yield even more menthium than Professor Williams did this evening, especially as I will extract your entire supply and reduce you to permanent idiocy. I will have no mercy on you, as I have had on the others I have operated on."
Dr. Bird blanched in spite of himself at the ominous words. "You have the whip hand for the moment, Slavatsky, but my time may come, and if it does, I will remember your kindness. I saw your operation on Professor Williams this evening, and I know your power. I also know that you stole the idea and the method from Swigert of Vienna. I saw you inject the fluid you drew into Willis's brain. Shall I tell what else I saw?" It was the dwarf's turn to blanch, but he recovered himself quickly.
"Into the chair with him!"
he roared. 3 of the men grasped the doctor and forced him into the chair, and Slavatsky started the generator. The violet light bathed Dr. Bird's head, and he felt a stiffness and contraction of his neck muscles, and, as he tried to shout out his knowledge of Slavatsky's treachery, he found that his vocal cords were paralyzed. Through a gathering haze, he could see Carson approaching with an anesthesia cone, and the sweet smell of lethane assailed his nostrils. He fought with all his force, but strong hands held him, and he felt himself slipping, and then falling into an immense void. His head slumped forward on his chest, and Slavatsky shut off the generator.
"On the table,"
he said briefly. 4 men picked up the Herculean frame of the unconscious doctor and hoisted him up on the table. Carson seized his head and bent it forward, and the dwarf took from a case a syringe with a 5-inch needle. He touched the point of it to the base of the doctor's brain. "Slavatsky, look!" cried Frank. With an exclamation of impatience, the dwarf turned and stared at a disc set on the wall of the cave. It was glowing brightly. With an oath, he dropped the syringe and snapped a switch, plunging the cave into darkness. A tiny panel in the door opened to his touch, and he stared out into the light.
"Soldiers!" he gasped. "Quick! The back way!"
As he spoke, there came a sound as a heavy body falling at the back of the cave. Slavatsky turned the switch and flooded the cave with light. At the back of the cave stood Operative Carnes, an automatic pistol in hand. "Open the main door," Carnes snapped. Slavatsky made a move towards the light, and Carnes' gun roared deafeningly in the confined space. The heavy bullet smashed into the wall an inch from the dwarf's hand, and he started back. "Open the main door," ordered Carnes again. The men stared at one another for a moment, and the dwarf's eyes fell.
"Open the door, Frank," he said.
Frank moved over to a lever. He glanced at Slavatsky, and a momentary gleam of intelligence passed between them. Frank raised his hand toward the lever, and Carnes' gun roared again, and Frank's arm fell limp from a smashed shoulder. "Slavatsky," said Carnes sternly. "Come here." Slowly the dwarf approached. "Turn around," said Carnes. He turned and felt the cold muzzle of Carnes' gun against the back of his neck. "Now, tell one of your men to open the door," said the detective. "If he promptly obeys your order, you are safe. If he does not, you die." Slavatsky hesitated for a moment, but the cold muzzle of the automatic bored into the back of his neck, and when he spoke, it was in a quavering whine. "Open the door, Carson," he whimpered. There was a moment of pause. "If that door is not open by the time I count 3, said Carnes. "As far as Slavatsky is concerned, it's just too bad. I have 4 shots left, and I'm a dead shot at this range. 1, 2... His lips framed the word 3, and his fingers were tightening on the trigger, when Carson jumped forward with an oath. He pulled the lever on the wall, and the door swung open. Carnes shouted, and through the opened door came a half-dozen Marines, followed by an officer. "Tie these men up," snapped Carnes. In a trice, the 6 men were securely bound, and Frank's bleeding shoulder was being skillfully treated by 2 of the Marines. Carnes turned his attention to the unconscious doctor. He rolled him over on his back and began to chafe his hands. An officer in a naval uniform came through the door, and with a swift glance around, bent over Dr. Bird. He raised one of the doctor's eyelids and peered closely at his eye, and then sniffed at his breath. "It's some anesthetic I don't know," he said. "I'll try a stimulant." He reached in his pocket for a hypodermic, but Carnes interrupted him. "Earlier in the evening, Dr. Bird said they were using lethane," he said. "Oh, that new gas the Chemical Warfare Service has discovered," said the surgeon. Without replying, Carnes began to feverishly search in the pockets of the unconscious scientist. With an exclamation of triumph, he drew out a bottle and uncorked it. A strong smell, as of garlic, penetrated the room, and he held the open bottle under Dr. Bird's nose. The doctor lay for a moment without movement, and then he coughed and sat up, half strangled with tears running down his face.
"Take that confounded bottle away, Carnes," he said. "Do you want to strangle me?"
He sat up and looked around.
"What happened?" he demanded.
Oh, yes, I remember now. That brute was about to operate on me.
How did you get here?
Never mind that, Doctor. Are you all right?
Right as a trivet, old dear. How did you get here so opportunely?
I was a little slow in locating Lieutenant Maynard and the Marines. When we got here, I was afraid we couldn't find the door, so I took Maynard and a detail around to the back, and I went up to the top and slid down our cord and looked in the window. You were unconscious. Slavlatsky was bending over you with a needle in his hand. I was about to try a shot at him when something called their attention to the men in front, and I squeezed through the window and dropped in on them. They didn't seem too glad to see me, but I overlooked that and insisted on inviting the rest of my friends in to share in the party. That's all.
Carnes, said the doctor. You're probably lying like a trooper when you make out that you did nothing, but I'll pry the truth out of you sooner or later. Now I've got to get to work. Send for Lieutenant Maynard. One of the Marines went out to get the flyer, and Dr. Bird stepped into the cabinet from which Slavlatsky had taken his record book earlier in the evening, and took out the leather-bound volume. He opened it and had started to read when Lieutenant Maynard entered the cave.
"Hello, Maynard," said the doctor, looking up. "Are the rest of the party on their way?"
"They will be here in less than 2 hours, Doctor."
"Good enough. Have someone sent to guide them here. In the meanwhile, I'm going to study these records. Keep the prisoners quiet. If they make a noise, gag them. I want to concentrate."
For an hour and a half, silence reigned in the cave. A stir was heard outside, and Admiral Clay, the president's personal physician, entered leading a stout gray-haired man. Dr. Bird whistled when he saw them, and leapt to his feet as another figure followed. "The president!" gasped Carnes as the officers came to a salute, and the Marines presented arms. The president nodded to his ex-guard, acknowledged the salute of the rest, and turned to Dr. Bird. "Have you met with success, Doctor?" he asked.
"I have, Mr. President. Or, rather, I hope that I have. At the same time, I would rather experiment on some other victim of their deviltry than the one you have brought me."
"My decision that the one I have brought shall be the first to be experimented on, as you term it, is unalterable." Dr. Bird bowed and turned to the dwarf, who had been a sullen witness of what had gone on.
"Slavlatsky," he said slowly. "Your game is up. I have witnessed one of your brain transfusions, and I know the method. I gather from your notes that the menthium you have hidden in that cabinet is still as potent as when it was first extracted from a living brain, but in this case, I'm going to draw it fresh from one of your gang. Some of the details of the operation are a little hazy to me, but those you will teach me. I am going to restore this man to the condition he was in before you did your devil's work on him, and you will direct my movements. Just what is the first step in removing the menthium from a brain?" The dwarf maintained a stubborn silence. "You refuse to answer?" asked the doctor in a feigned surprise. "I thought that you would rather instruct me and have me try the operation first on other men. Since you prefer that I operate on you first, I will be glad to do so." He stepped to the opposite wall, and in a few moments had opened the dwarf's hiding place and taken out the flask of menthium. "Carson," he said, "after you had watched Slavlatsky inject menthium into Willis, you took Lethane and expected him to inject menthium into your brain. Instead of doing so, he withdrew a portion from your brain and put it in this flask. I have reason to believe from his secret records which I found in the cabinet with this flask that he has done so regularly. Are you willing to instruct me while I remove the menthium from him?" "The dirty swine!" shouted Carson. "I'll do anything to get even with him, but I have never performed the operation. Only Slavlatsky and Willis have operated." "Will you help me, Willis?" asked Dr. Bird. "I'll be glad to, Doctor. I am sick of this business anyway. At first, Slavlatsky just planned to give us abnormally keen brains, but lately he has been talking of setting himself up as Emperor of the world, and I am sick of it. I think I would have broken with him and told all I know soon anyway." "Throw him in that chair," said Dr. Bird. Despite the howlings and strugglings of the dwarf,
3 of the Marines strapped him in the chair beneath the tube. The dwarf howled and frothed at the mouth and directed a final appeal for mercy to the president.
"Spare me, your excellency," he howled. "I will put my brains at your service and make you the greatest mentality of all time. Together, we can conquer and rule the world. I will show you how to build hundreds of ships like mine."
The president turned his back on the dwarf and spoke curtly. "Proceed with your experiments, Dr. Bird," he said. Slavatsky directed his appeals to the doctor, who peremptorily silenced him. "I told you a few hours ago, Slavatsky, that the time might come when I would remember your threats against me. I will show you the same mercy now as you promised me then. Carnes, put a cone over his face." End of Stolen Brains by Captain S.P. Meek. Narrated by Miranda Colleen Johnson. This is the end of Part 3 of 4.